so we're going to add session, and we can do it right in here, but I have a pretty good idea of what we're eventually going to want, and so I think maybe an easier way to do this is to create a file, session.go, package file browser, and I'm going to make a type session. So this is going to have all the state we need in our session. So what am I going to have in here?
Yeah, create UUID.
The bucket.
So we'll have bucket and credentials, which are both strings. Okay. That'll match what we have on the index page, the bucket and the credentials. So we'll store it in this type session. And then when I have that, I can make two functions, get session and put session, for getting the session and putting it back. And this way I can sort of wrap up on my handlers and make it easier. Okay. So I think for get session, I'll return a session and maybe a boolean, or maybe I'll just always return a session, and it'll just be empty if they haven't done anything yet. And here what we'll do is we'll take a context and a request. Okay. So get session, context, which is a context, and rec, which is an issue request. And I can get the session this way. The reason I need context is I'm going to get it from Memcache. So to make a request to Memcache, I have to use the context. It turns out, since we have the request, we could actually just get rid of the context here and just take the request, but I'll take both. Because we'll want it down here too. And so just to make them look similar. So to put session, I'll have the context. And then this time, instead of the request, I can take the response. Okay. And so I get the session out of the request, and I'll put the session into the response. I'm not actually going to put it in the response. I'm going to put it in Memcache, and in response, I'm going to provide a cookie that has a session ID. But we're sort of distracting how that actually happens to make it easier for us to use on the other side. Okay? So type session get put. Everybody have this?
I need to do my imports.
Okay, inside of our routes, now index is going to be something like context, half engine, nothing context, and then session is get session. The session will always be something. It'll always be available. Now, if you have not submitted the form, bucket and credentials will be the empty string. But it'll never be nil, okay, the way this is written.
If you're using request twice, but you're using request to make context, and then you're using context and request to get session.
Yeah. So like I said, we could have taken context out of the get session, but I just left it in there to make it mirror, to make them similar, right? Because both of these start with context. I'm definitely going to need it here. So just to make the API similar, I'm just going to keep it here. But you're right, I could have used the request command. So it's not necessary, but it's just almost all these data things, they all take the context as the first argument, so I just wanted to keep that around. Okay, so we say context, new app context, then session is a new set, get session, okay? And so here the idea is that if I'm posting the form, so if method is post, so if rec.method is post, that means somebody submitted the bucket and the credentials. So I'll
set them on my session, right? I'll say session dot bucket equal bucket, and session dot credentials equal rec dot form value credentials. So I set the session bucket and then the session credentials right from the form values, and then the last thing I do is put the session back. Okay?
So this put session, context response, that's gonna write the session to a cookie and memcache all in one go, okay? So we get the session, we set its properties, and then we put it back. And this way, in our browse, we can likewise get our session, get information from it, okay? And if the information isn't there, we can do whatever we need to do, but we'll get it from the session.
So we've added state to our stateless HTTP server is what we've done. Any questions so far? Everybody got this?
The context, is that coming from, because on the routes, it looked like your import, sorry, on sessions, it looked like your import was golang.org context. Yeah, but then I have also seen that, can't we do context through Google Golang.org app engine?
The older version of the App Engine libraries had context inside of it, and the newer one does it this way.
Okay, so we want to use that.
Yeah. In a few months, I'm sure this will be pretty much the only one available.
Well, because it wasn't there, let me see on the, let's see what page is that on. Maybe it's on the handlers page. I don't know which one, if that's the correspondence. Where do you do the context there? App engine, new context, what's the difference there?
What difference with what?
So we get context from app engine, new context. And the import on that is the Google Golang.org app engine, right?
Uh-huh.
And then what's the import on the other context? On the session.go?
This is the same as,
Yeah. No, but on the session.go page, your context there is different.
It's the same context. So I'm importing this library for the context, and here, same context. I just added the explicit here, that is the type. So app engine new context returns this kind of thing, this type.
Okay.
Before, since it was colon equal, I could leave it out, and it inferred it, and so therefore I didn't have to import it.
Okay.
But that is the type of what it was returning.
Okay. Let me put that in explicit.
So let's say get session.
So I think maybe here, after we update the session, so if you post the form, maybe we should redirect, right? Like I just click submit, I don't want to go back to the same page.
So let's do that. HTTP redirect, redirect, and then we'll go to /browse. Again to the slash.
Okay. So redirect to browse. So after I save my session, then I'm going to redirect to /browse/. So if I click submit, it's going to go here. Okay, but it's going to go via a redirect. Make sense? But if I didn't post, if I didn't submit the form, then we render the index page. Like we're doing before.
So let's see if that's working. It shouldn't work, but let's see what happens. Not implemented. Like I said, it wasn't supposed to work. The reason it doesn't work is we haven't implemented it. We got it here and it panicked. So we need to implement get session, okay? So the way we're going to do that is we're going to store session ID in the cookie and store data in Memcache. Okay? So we need to get the cookie. So we can do cookie and give it a name. So let's call it session ID. So cookie := rec.cookie and then in quotes session ID. And that actually returns two things. So it returns, is it an error or a boolean? You guys know? Well, it'll tell me. Error. So if there's an error, that means the cookie's not set. So there is not equal nil. Cookie will create one. And this is where we're going to have to generate an ID. So session ID, comma, underscore, colon, equal, uuid.new v4. That will create a UUID, and then here all we have to do is session ID.string. Okay, so if no cookie exists, we'll create one like this. Now we have a cookie with a value equal to the session ID. So actually, let's make another change, another addition here. Or cookie.value is equal to the empty string. Okay, just in case somehow there was a cookie set but it had that value, we'll do it this way. So if there was an error or the cookie's value is not set properly, then we generate a new session. Okay. So now we have a session ID. The session ID is cookie.value. That's where we get the session ID. Okay, so then we can say memcache.get. Let's get memcache in there. Context and then the cookie value. Okay. That's going to return possibly item and an error. So now I'm going to ask memcache for the session from the session ID of the cookie. So if there's an error, then we should create one. The key will be the value is so if there's no item in there, we can just say the value is the empty string or something, okay? Maybe we'll have to revisit that. So now we have item, comma, error, colon, equal, memcache.get, the context, the cookie value, because the cookie value is the session ID. If there was an error, then we set the item to just this made up one, okay? So now at this point we know we have an item. And the item's value is what we've stored in the session. And so we need to JSON decode that. Because we're going to store our session as a JSON object inside of memcache. So I can say var session, okay? So I'm going to create a new session variable. And then I'm going to fill it with JSON. So I'm going to say new decoder, bytes.newReader. Okay. Actually, I think it's strings. Well, no, this is a slice of bytes. So bytes.newReader, and we'll pass in item.value. Okay. So JSON.newDecoder, bytes.newReader item value. There's another way we can do this. What's the other way we can do this? So I'm about to do this. Decode. So we're going to fill session from the data that was here. There's a slightly shorter way to do this. Unmarshal. Remember unmarshal? So we can just do this instead. Okay. So create the session and then unmarshal the bytes into the session. And then we'll have our session. And so the last thing we have to do is just return. Okay. Now the reason that this can return an error, the reason I'm not checking that error is I don't care. Because there is such a state as the empty session, and that's okay. An empty session is both of them are blank. And so we'll not worry about the error here, we'll handle it on the other side. Okay? We'll look and say, is there a bucket? There's no bucket defined. Okay, redirect to the form to make a bucket. So we're just not going to check this error because we don't care what it does. And we'll just return the session one way or the other. So either we end up with a session with a bucket of credentials the user entered, or we end up with a session that has nothing in it. But either way, we have a session. Okay? So everybody have this get session here? So get the session ID out of the cookie, get the session out of memcache, and turn it into an actual session object in Go. So that's how we get the session. So that should fix our, this guy, right? So now he renders. But now the issue is we're not putting. So if I actually enter a bucket, it has another panic because the put session is not implemented. So we need to implement this guy, okay? So for put session, what we want to do is, we're missing something here. The session itself, okay? So I've added another parameter on the end here for the session. And that makes sense because get return to session, put takes a session, okay? We could also put a method on session called save or something, or put, and move this as the receiver. We could have done that, but this will work. Okay, so we have to reverse this process, right? We're going to do the opposite of what we just did, right? The mirror image of what we just did. So the first thing we have to do is encode it as JSON. So these for bytes, comma, error, colon equal JSON.marshal session. That'll give us our bytes. If there was an error, well, I'm not sure what we should do if that happens. The chances of this happening seem extremely small. So I'm just going to return. I don't know how that can really happen. That would mean somehow that the JSON library was unable to create the bytes. Maybe if you ran out of memory, I don't know. So we're just going to return if that happens. So we've done this step, right? So now we move up and we do this step. Right, so we're going sort of backwards. So now we have to set it in memcache. Okay, there's an issue here. What's the issue?
We don't have the UID.
Yeah, we don't have the ID of the session. So that's an issue, right? I don't know where to save it. So I think maybe we should add to the session struct an ID. Okay, so all I did is went to the session struct and added ID string, and then we'll set it in here. We don't actually have to change anything, but I'll add it just in case. Okay, so right after we unmarshal, we set the session ID to the cookie value. Okay. Now sometimes the JSON guy will fill it, but we'll always set the ID. So even if I have a blank session, now we'll have a blank session with at least an ID. Okay. Now we're not actually going to use the ID in our code, but we have to have it down here. So now I can set. Okay. So memcache.set context and an item. So memcache.set context comma ampersand memcache.item, and then in curly braces we give it our key and value. So the key here is session.id. The value is, what's the value? The value is B's, right? And so I think this returns an error. We're just not going to do anything with the error. Just like I said, what can we do? If you're unable to save a session, I mean, there's not much we can do. You know, we can tell the user there was an error, but is that great? I don't know. So we're just going to ignore it. All right, so now we've set it in memcache. The last step we have to do is we have to write the cookie. So we can do http.setCookie. You give it the response and a cookie. So http.setCookie, res comma, and then ampersand http.cookie, and then curly braces. And up here we can see that there's a name. I think that's right. Yeah, the name will be session ID. So session ID in quotes, and then the value is the session.id. Okay? So we turn it into JSON, save that JSON into memcache, and then write a code. Make sense? Okay, so the last bit we have to do, I have to update this, put here, take the session. So now it should save the session. So let's try that by resubmitting the form. Okay, it redirected me to browse. Do I have a session? That's the question. If we look in the resources cookies, session ID. So it did write a session ID. So it wrote the cookie at least. Did it put stuff in memcache? So let me get this key and look and see if it's in memcache. Oops, there's a... Cool, so it's in there. And see how it's been JSON encoded? So we have the ID, the bucket, and the credentials. And that's what I pasted in. So now we have it in memcache, we can get it, and we can put it back, okay? Does it make sense? I'll put that in. I'll add that to... Okay, so now we have that implemented. We can save the session on the index page, and now we need to use it on the browse page, okay? So down here, I can get this context, and then I can say session : get session, context, and the request, okay? And that's why we did that, because now it's really easy to get the session. I don't have to repeat myself with that code. I can just use this function. So it's just one line of code now to get the session. And I know the session has the bucket credentials on it. So I can use the bucketing credentials to fill our browse HTML page, okay? And so real quick together, we can get started on how this is going to be built, and then you can finish it up. So the first thing we want to do is we need a model for our browse HTML page for the data that's what we're going to put on the page, okay? So I think what we want to do is, I'm going to call it browse model. So type browse model struct, and it can be uppercase or lowercase, whatever. So I created this. And I think that we need a bucket property, at least, right? And this will be the bucket you're looking at. And that way we can implement at the top of the page, bucket colon and the name of the bucket. And I think we also need a folder. And probably lots of other things, but let's just get started with this, okay? So we're going to add more things to the model, but for now all we have is bucket and folder. Okay? And so, where do I get the bucket from?
The bucket's coming from the form originally, and so once it comes from the form,
Yeah, it's in session. So I say model colon equal ampersand browse model. I'm creating a browse model. And the bucket, I say bucket colon comes from the session. Session dot bucket. Okay? Where do I get the folder from? So the folder comes from the URL. So you say folder colon equal strings dot split in. You pass in rec dot URL dot path, comma, slash for the split, and 3, and then 2. Okay? That's the rest of the URL after slash browse. So you have slash browse slash, and that'll be the folder. And then instead of nil here, we pass in model. Okay? So we're still going to render the browse HTML page, but now we're going to render it with this data. And then we can use that in our template. So if we go to our browse HTML template, you know, I can now replace this with, what do I replace it with?
dot folder, dot bucket.
Dot bucket, exactly. Right? And then dot folder. So let's see if that worked. So I risk bucket and folder here. Oh, I stopped the server. I didn't get anything. I get anything. So maybe the session is not existing? Okay, so it makes sense I didn't get anything for the folder. So let's test that real quick. Okay, so folder's working. Test here matches the test up here. The bucket's not working, so something's wrong there. I have a session ID. So I got the session. So the bucket must be empty in the session. So I think we should add some logging to see what's wrong here. Log.conf context session. We'll put %d. Okay, and then I'll refresh and see what we get. Yeah, sure enough, they're empty. So why are they empty? So let's dive into our get session. See what went wrong. We get the cookie. I think that's working. But then maybe this isn't. So let's debug that. Okay, so all I'm doing is adding log statements to see what our data is. Go to my terminal, clear it, and then go to the page and refresh. And then go back to the terminal and look and see what the data was. Item. It has this key, but no data. Is that key changing every time? E84. No, the key's staying the same.
Those 2 errors you ignored in the
picking up and posting cookies?
It could be,
Is it in the data,
Or
is it in Memcache?
Memcache, right?
but when we looked in Memcache, it was in there.
No, no. 84.
Size of cache, type in zero.
No such key, no.
Huh.
When you restarted it, it flushed.
Thank you.
flushed
That's
the cache.
exactly the problem. When I restarted the server, it cleared the data. So so the issue is that the session got cleared when I restarted the server. That's a downside of using Memcache. But that's not actually a bug. The bug here is this. If there is no bucket, if I've not chosen a bucket, I should redirect the user, okay? So if session.bucket is equal to the empty string, then I should redirect to the main page, right? So if no bucket has been chosen, then redirect. That's the idea. Because it's like I just try to browse, but I can't browse without choosing a bucket. So now what should happen is I redirect here and it takes me back. And now if I fill this in, now it works, okay? So the reason it wasn't working before was my session got cleared. But now it's saving it and pulling it back properly, okay? So, make sense?
When I restart the server, everything in Memcache gets erased. And that's what happened. Okay, so what we need to do was a few things we need to do. We need to add listing of the bucket to get this list here. We need to add uploading files. And we need to add downloading the links. That's actually two things. There's clicking on a folder versus clicking on a file. So that's at least three more things we need to do. I think maybe the easiest to start with is listing. So what we need to do here is add to our browse model some type to represent a single entry in our list. So we need to add that and then have a slice of them so that we can render it in our page. And we need to get that from Google Cloud Storage, okay? And that's what we're going to work on next.
To help you, I need to add one more thing. And that's how to do this new JSON credentials thing. Because we haven't talked about that, okay? So I'm going to show you how to do that, and then you can write the listing code. So create a new file called storage.go. Package file browser. And this is going to be the get cloud context function that we wrote before. So this will be the app, let's call it AE context for the app engine context. And it will return the cloud context, okay? So it'll return the context. So we wrote this before, so I'm going to go get that real quick. I think we have it in here, actually. So this guy, okay? And we're going to change him to be a little different. Maybe a little easier to use. Okay, so grab that guy, plop him in here. If you want that, I'll just paste it in Scratch. Okay, so instead of pulling it out of the app engine token source, we're going to create a different token source. Okay, so the token source is going to be JWT token source. And that's like JSON. It's a JSON file, right? And that's the file I gave you. So if we look at the docs, in the underneath OAuth 2 Google. So in this Golang X OAuth 2 Google provides support for making OAuth 2 authorized and authenticated HTTP requests to Google APIs. And so it turns out this is a library you would use not just in App Engine, but if you wanted to use cloud storage in some other application, you would probably use this to do the authentication. Okay. And so they have some examples. So here's one with the service account, right? So the email, the scopes, the token URL, the subject. This is what's stored in that JSON file. Okay? It has some of this information in it. And we can use this function to do it. JWT config from JSON. Uses a Google Developer Service Account JSON key file to read the credentials. And once we have that, we can use that to make our HTTP request instead. So what's going on here is instead of having App Engine Development Server hand over the credentials, we're going to use the credentials in a file. And then for us, that's much easier because if we just upload that file with our application, we can access that in App Engine. Just a lot easier to reason about than having this convoluted process. We're just going to have a file, okay? And it tells you right here you can generate it from this website, which is what I showed you before. And so this is what we need to do. We need to read the JSON file, then load it into this JWT config, and then create our HTTP client. Now this will look a little different for App Engine, but basically that's the process, okay? So first we need to read it. So there's two options here. We could read it here and change this to return an error, or we could read it within the init and store it globally and read it when we start our application. I'm just going to change this to an error and we'll do it that way. So we need to read the bytes of the file. So I'm just copying that from their example. Data, comma, error, colon equal, IO to a read file, and then we give it a path to a file. So I don't know where you stored this on your machine, but I'm going to copy, for me, I'm going to copy what did I call it? To my desktop and gcs.json. Okay, so I just plopped it in my desktop, and now there's a GCS.json in there. And then I will do that here. So that's not right. That's what's important. So I'm just going to copy that. So yours would be different, whatever this path is, would be different. If you're on Windows, it would be c:/user/your username/desktop, but otherwise it would be similar. And then I'm going to add at the end. Okay? Now, obviously, if you were wanting to upload this app to App Engine, you can't use that path. You can use a relative path, which means you can put it in your project. But the danger there is that you might accidentally upload your credentials to your GitHub. And then you've sort of given anybody access to your bucket. So that's probably not what you want to do, okay? But you could do that if you want. If you have a private GitHub account, then that's okay. But if it's public, that's probably not a good idea. But anyway, we have to have this file available. So I'll get those bytes. If error is not equal nil.
Question, Caleb.
Yeah.
Could you have done for your path there tilde/desktop, or was it not recommended that?
I don't know. Maybe. It might work. I doubt it, though. Tilde is kind of like a shell thing, and we're not really in the shell anymore, so I don't think it would resolve that. But it might. I don't know. You can use os.homedir, I think. I think that's in there. Okay, so we have our data, and now we have to turn that into a JWT thing. So we use this. Okay, so we say conf, error, colon equal, google.jwt config from JSON. The first thing you pass it's the data, and then this bit here is what changes. This is the scope, okay? And so we say storage dot, and let me resolve that. It's, actually, it's right down here. Scope full control. Cool.
So there's sort of two things going on here. We're loading the JSON from that file, and then we're asking for scopes equal to this. And the scopes are the things you would like to use, okay? So when you build up your OAuth credentials, part of that request is, and I want to use these APIs. And that service account, you can restrict to only certain things. You can say, you can use this service account for YouTube, but you can't use it for Google Maps or whatever. Or you can use it for this bucket, but not this bucket. Because remember I told you that one of the nice things about service accounts, and the reason why security people like it, is you can restrict the access a particular service has, so that it can only do one or two things. And that way, if that system gets compromised, if you screwed up your encryption, you've isolated the damage it can do, okay? And so that's an important part of security, is not just, well, getting security right, it's also minimizing the potential for damage by isolating the way service can do. And so that's what we're doing here. We're saying, I want to use these credentials for this scope, and this is only for storage access. Yeah?
So you have in your arguments AE context, but then it seems like when you call it like on 2930, it's app engine context, should that be changed?
Well, this is our old code. We
Yeah,
haven't
so I just
updated
wonder
it
if I
yet.
was reading that wrong.
So it's not ready to be used yet. So,
And then another question I have is like, the error, sometimes like on 17 and 22, you're using equal and equal for variable assignment. And sometimes I have to like, take out the equal and equal and just make it equal, like on 22. Why is it sometimes it seems like I need to do that, sometimes not, what am I missing?
if you're creating a new variable, you have to use colon equal. If you're reusing an old variable, you have to use equal.
Aren't you using the error again on 22?
Yeah, but conf is new.
So that means it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so now we have that. That returns this config object. This config object has some stuff on it, okay? But that's what we want. Token source, okay? And that's where we'll use our AE context. I can't remember if it returns a... tconfig token source. Just a token source, okay. And so we can use that here. So we get our token source. So token source colon equal conf dot token source, and we pass in AE context. And that is what we can use here. Okay. So now what we have is I create a token source, then I create an HTTP client. The transport is this OAuth2 transport, and the source here is this token source that I created, not the other one we saw before. And this one is coming from a file, explicitly from a file, not from whatever the development app server happens to be there. Okay, that's what it's doing before. And that's why when we ran the app server, we had to run it with all the special command line arguments, because that's how we were feeding. So the auth was going through the local dev server into this. And now we're doing it in Go. We're just saying, get the file from JSON and put it in there, okay? And so that's what we have for this, okay? So if this works, we should have access to the bucket. Any questions about that? Okay, and I will add that to the code as well. Okay, so using that context in here. Oh, because I'm already there. We can get the context here and use it for requests to Google Cloud Storage. The requests we've already seen before. So now the exercise is to list this folder. Any questions? Okay, so just list the contents of this folder, and we'll get that done, and then we'll move on to the next bit, the uploading and the linking.
just work on that.